Okay. So again, hi everyone, and welcome to the California Coastal Resilience Network webinar series. My name is Jessica Madden, and I am the facilitator for the Coastal Resilience Network, as well as the Sea Grant State Fellow for the State Coastal Conservancy. The California Coastal Resilience Network promotes knowledge exchange through webinars on climate-induced impacts on human communities and coastal habitat. We will provide a link to the network if you'd like to join or watch past webinars, including today's, on our website. These links can be found on the follow-up email that you will receive after today's webinar. So to go into webinar logistics for today, we will listen and watch the presentation for about 25-30 minutes, and then follow up with a Q&A session. During the presentation, please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A box on the bottom of the Zoom screen. This webinar is being recorded, and so it'll be available for review after the webinar. Today's presentation will provide an overview from Sustainable Conservation about new and essential tools for accelerated restoration permitting, how they can be used with other permitting pathways, and technical resources available to help project proponents and agency staff use these new regulatory tools. We are joined today by our presenter, Stephanie Falzone, and Program Director, Erica Lovejoy. Stephanie Falzone is the Senior Project Manager at Sustainable Conservation. She grew up and currently lives about a mile from San Francisco Bay, so coastal resilience is a topic near and dear to her. She gained hands-on habitat restoration experience through an internship with students and teachers restoring a watershed, a project of Point Blue Conservation Science. She started working at Sustainable Conservation in 2016 on the Plant Right program, and since 2018, she's been applying her organizational and outreach skills to the Accelerating Restoration program. So thank you so much for joining us today, Stephanie and Erica. And with that, I will pass the virtual mic over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you for that introduction, Jessica. And for those of you who don't know us, Sustainable Conservation is a California-based environmental nonprofit that advances the collaborative stewardship of California's land, air, and water for the benefit of nature and people. Our Accelerating Restoration team has been working with agencies, landowners, and restoration project proponents to incentivize and speed up the pace of habitat restoration by creating more efficient regulatory pathways. Today, I want to tell you about the variety of efficient permitting tools out there and the latest big wins for restoration permitting that can help you and your grant awardees get their projects done sooner. First, I will talk about why we are doing this work. As you might all know, the key laws protecting habitat and species, like the Endangered Species Act and Clean Water Act, don't provide mechanisms to efficiently and proactively fix the environmental problems we face. And many of you have probably experienced that firsthand. But the good news is that through the efforts of our organization and our partners, more agencies have created restoration-specific regulatory tools to help address the urgent environmental problems we face and put restoration permitting on a separate regulatory path from development projects. Through the creation and implementation of these new efficient permitting tools, agencies are empowering their staff to do things in a different way. Some of the efficient permitting tools that we've worked with our partners to develop over the years are programmatic permits, and just to make sure we all know what those are, I'll cover that now. They are approvals that are written in advance to cover commonly implemented restoration project types. The types of projects that qualify and their specific conditions are all listed up front, and that can result in a lot more regulatory certainty for both agency staff and applicants and make better use of grant funds. But it takes a lot of upfront work to develop them, so that's where Sustainable Conservation comes in, to help draft technical materials and coordinate input from agencies and project implementers. And the work that our team and our partners has done over the years has resulted in there being a lot more tools in California's Programmatic permitting toolbox, as we sometimes like to call it. And we want you to know about these permitting options for projects and what's out there so you can benefit from them, because they're not a mandated approach. So if you or regulatory staff don't know about them or how to use them, you could miss out on that opportunity. So that's why I'll be giving an overview of each of these efficient permitting tools, and then I'll talk about an example project to show how they can be used together. And I'll be starting with the ones in this green box here that are for small projects. We highly recommend using them if your project is eligible and wanted to make sure to remind people about that, because sometimes people will contact the agency about some of these other tools when they really don't need to use them. And these are still great options. I'll start with CEQA Categorical Exemption 15333. That is for projects not exceeding 5 acres in size, but does not have a linear foot limit. So to use that, CAT-X, the CEQA lead agency, files a notice of exemption, and Natural Resources Secretary Wade Crowfoot issued a memo in 2021 to clarify that the use of mechanized equipment or the presence of special status species, respectively, does not preclude using this categorical exemption. That was a clarification that was needed. And there's an interesting case where if your project is less than 5 acres, but over 500 linear feet, what you would be using instead of this small project general order is the newer statewide general order that I'll cover later. But just an interesting situation you might be in. So the general 401 water quality certification for small habitat restoration projects, which is a general order. So that does have a 500-foot and 5-acre limit. And the benefits of using that are reduced fees, a faster process, and it also opens the door to the Habitat Restoration and Enhancement Act, or HREA, with California Department of Fish and Wildlife. HREA was created through legislation that Sustainable Conservation sponsored in 2014, and the program was renewed for another 5 years in 2022. It has the same size limits as the general order I just talked about, and to use HREA, your project must meet the eligibility requirements for the general order and the CEQA CAT-X, but it does not have to use them. So, for example, a project may get CEQA and water board coverage through Fisheries Restoration Grant Program and still use HREA. And what HREA gets you is a single approval that covers your lake and streambed alteration agreement and compliance with the California Endangered Species Act in one single approval. There are 2 different ways to use HREA, a 30-day process if you're already enrolled under this general order, and that's under section 1653, and then a 60-day process if it's not enrolled under this order already, and that's under section 1652. We have a guidance document on our website and some videos that walk you through this whole process. And for now, I'll just give a couple of tips that we've heard from CDFW. So we highly recommend that you contact your CDFW regional staff for a pre-consultation meeting to discuss your project. And also remember to include work windows for other species like riparian birds that your project may impact and not just fish. We've heard sometimes those get forgotten about. And another tip I have is to apply for the full 5-year term allowed in HREA, just in case your project takes a little longer to implement than originally planned. Sometimes things happen. These 3 permitting pathways have been used for a lot of wood loading projects and some beaver dam analog projects over the years because the size limit is for cumulative linear feet. So there are some projects, placement of large wood, or beaver dam analogs that happen at maybe a few places along a total stream length that's longer than 500 feet. But as long as the total cumulative length of stream bank impact is 500 feet or less, you could still qualify. So since it takes some work to figure that out, the Wood for Salmon Working Group has a handy project size calculator for wood loading projects that can help you figure out if your project fits into those size limits. And we'll put a link to that in the chat. And now I'll move on to the Programmatic Biological Opinions, or PBOs, with National Marine Fisheries Service and the consistency determination with the Coastal Commission. These can be used with these smaller permitting tools or the ones for these larger projects. These PBOs are administered by the NOAA Restoration Center. There are 4 covering the anadromous waters of California statewide, but I'm going to only talk about the coastal ones today. They cover a similar set of project types around riparian, wetland habitat enhancement and restoration, things like fish passage improvement, upslope watershed restoration, a lot of project types. And the main benefit of using one of these is a much faster less expensive process than individual project biological assessment and biological opinion. So instead of that whole process, you submit a checklist application form to NOAA Restoration Center staff, and they review that with National Marine Fisheries Service staff. And then after the project's done, there's a construction reporting form to submit. To be eligible to use any of these, you would need to have a federal nexus that often comes through funding from the NOAA Restoration Center or issuance of a Section 404 or Section 10 permit from the Army Corps. And for all of these, you'll hear me say this a lot, a pre-consultation call and discussion is essential. So I will share the contact information for NOAA Restoration Center staff for each of these. And I'm going to go from north to south. I'll talk just a bit about each of these because there are some differences between them, but there's a lot of other detail I don't have time to cover or we'd be here all day. So if you want to use any of these PBOs, you will have to read them in more detail about which species they cover and activities and all the eligibility details and limitations. So starting up north with the North Coast PBO, that's overseen by Bob Pagliuco in the Arcata office. The 2022 version added part of Oregon in anticipation of Klamath Dam removal. And it was written while we were writing the statewide restoration programmatic biological assessment with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA Restoration Center in the Corps. So the project types and protection measures you would notice are very similar between the two of those. And this PBO also allows for late arriving action agencies like the Natural Resources Conservation Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Reclamation, and others. And something different about this new version is that it does not have a total 1,000-foot dewatering limit. Instead, it has a limit of no more than 1,000 feet at a time. So that was a change from the previous version, and it also covers monitoring. The Central Coast PBO, that's administered by Joe Petrich out of the Santa Rosa office. That covers part of Humboldt and Mendocino down to SLO County. And I have to point out, even though it is gray on here, it does not cover inside San Francisco Bay. And unlike the new version of the North Coast PBO, it does have a dewatering limit of 1,000 feet total. And there's some other limitations and things you would need to read about. The South Coast PBO is managed by Ruth Goodfield, and that covers from northern SLO County down to the U.S.-Mexico border. Covered activities are fairly similar to the other ones, but this one allows for the removal of small dams with explosives. So there's that. The size limit on this PBO is smaller than the other ones. It has a 500-foot dewatering limit and a ½ an acre or less for the staging area instead of 1 acre. And for projects in the coastal zone, having to get a coastal development permit was an expensive and difficult hurdle for restoration projects. It was a real disincentive. People would avoid working in the coastal zone. And to address that, we worked with the NOAA Restoration Center to set up an advanced approval in the form of a consistency determination, or CD, from the California Coastal Commission. There's one covering the North and Central Coast and one for the South Coast. And over the past 10 years that the North and Central Coast CD has been in place, it has been used to cover 29 projects, tripling the average annual rate of project approval in the coastal zone and saving significant time and costs to implement these projects. So that CD was renewed for another 10 years in December of 2022. Your contact for using one of these CDs will be the same NOAA Restoration Center contact for the PBO that you would be using to get access to this CD. And building off the success of these permits for smaller projects and these regional permits with the Restoration Center, we moved on to working on a statewide scale. And while I'm talking about these new statewide authorizations, I'll also talk about some complementary permitting tools with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. So through these agencies' interrelated permitting processes, we help them develop 2 statewide coordinated programmatic authorizations that were completed in August of 2022 for a set of commonly done aquatic and riparian habitat restoration types. So on the federal side, to start with that, to cover Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, we helped with a statewide programmatic biological opinion for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and that works in tandem with the NOAA permitting, as well as Army Corps permitting and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service funding. And next, on the state side, at the same time, we helped the State Water Resources Control Board develop a statewide programmatic permit or general order, along with a programmatic CEQA document, and that's the PEIR. And I'll talk about each of these separately and get into more detail, but first I'll talk about what they have in common and the significance of having these new permitting tools in place. These authorizations are a big deal because they can cover larger projects and projects with multiple benefits like groundwater recharge, recreation, or flood risk reduction. And when you use these permitting pathways, you don't have to limit your project to that 5-acre, 500 cumulative foot limit that I talked about earlier. A key part of both of these authorizations is the definition of a restoration project. It varies slightly between the two, but in essence, it's that a project results in a net increase in aquatic or riparian resource functions or services. And that's through implementation of the eligible project types, relevant protection measures, and consideration of the design guidelines. I will also point out that nothing in these authorizations precludes them from being used for mitigation projects. All restoration projects that meet the definition of restoration, regardless of the reason for the restoration project, may be eligible. The project types and protection measures are coordinated between these two state and federal authorizations, so that helps save time and money and increases regulatory certainty. And we encourage people to use the design guidelines and protection measures in these authorizations as a planning tool. Really set yourself up for an easier permitting process. The protection measures use a menu approach, so you would put in the applicable measures for your project, and it is possible to modify the protection measures based on site and project-specific conditions. And for even more coordination, because this wasn't enough agencies to work with, we worked with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. They reviewed protection measures and work windows for species that are duly listed, so listed under California Endangered Species Act and the federal ESA. And they also reviewed certain sections of the PEIR. So what are all these project types I was talking about? There's 10 main categories. It covers a lot of different types. There's a lot of detail, especially under number 9 and 10. Some things you may notice in here: removal of tide gates, tidal, subtidal restoration, invasive species removal, removal and remediation of pilings, just to name a few, but we tried to make this as comprehensive as possible. And just to dig in a little deeper to some of the coastal activities, we wanted to pull those out of the document for this. Some of those include tidal marsh restoration, coastal dunes, living shorelines, creation of ecotone and horizontal levees like the one I'm watering at while I was a straw intern back in 2013. That's at Pickleweed Park in San Rafael. And a point I want to make here is that just because a project activity is not explicitly mentioned in the details under a project types, perhaps because it's a newer technique like creating a coarse sand beach as part of a tidal marsh restoration, does not necessarily mean that the project is ineligible to use these authorizations. So that's one of the reasons a pre-application discussion with agency staff about your project is so important. And now I'll get into a bit more detail about each of these authorizations. And I'll start with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service PBO. That was completed with NOAA Restoration Center, the Army Corps, and multiple U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service programs like the Coastal Program, Partners, Refuges, Fish and Aquatic Conservation Program. I'll note that if the project if your project may affect federally listed species, but not adversely, then you don't need to go through a formal consultation process and don't need to use this PBO. So if you don't need formal consultation, don't worry about this. But if you do, this is a great option instead of going through individual project, that whole PBO process. So similar with the NMFS PBOs, I use a checklist application form. You get approval within 30 to 60 days once your application is deemed complete. And then there's a simplified post-construction form to fill out. The number of species that this covers is precedent setting, 72 species, a take coverage for 36 animal species. We've got plants, mammals, birds, reptiles, butterflies, vernal pool fairy shrimp, amphibians, some coastal examples, the least tern, California ridgeways, rail, western snowy plover, salt marsh harvest mouse, and tidewater goby. And to be covered under this PBO, like the NOAA PBOs, you need to have a federal nexus. So that can come from being funded, authorized, or carried out by one of the action agencies on this consultation. Those are those federal agencies you see here, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service programs that were part of this consultation. And as with the North Coast NIPS PBO, there is a process for late arriving action agencies to use this programmatic. General questions about this consultation can be directed to Marissa Reed, Section 7 coordinator at the regional office, and project-specific questions should be directed to your local field office. And you will also be seeking technical assistance from your field office as part of the consultation, as part of the process before you submit your application. So, we've got designated contacts and email addresses at each office to help you out. There's an additional efficiency from this PBO. As I said, we had CDFW review the measures, and a kind of a bonus efficiency we got from that and from putting a bit of language into the take statement is that DFW can issue what's called a restoration consistency determination. And this is a great option if you've got species at your project that are duly listed, but not fully protected species. So this CD is in lieu of an incidental take permit from CDFW. It's issued within 30 days, has no fee. Financial assurances and full mitigation are not required. So it's a great option if it can work for your project, and it can also be used with the NOAA PBOs that I talked about, except for the South Coast one, so just the North and Central Coast. As with many things, pre-consultation is crucial, especially for this one. And so to just get started and discuss your project, you want to contact the Cutting Green Tape team at this email address here. If you are in a situation where you have some fully protected species or some other CISA listed species that are, not also federally listed, the restoration management permit is a great option. We want to make sure people know about that one. It doesn't require financial assurances or full mitigation. There's no fee. And you are encouraged to use any protection measures from the Fish and Wildlife Service PBO that are applicable. And this has been used to cover some pretty large scale restoration projects. So definitely reach out to CDFW about this one if you need this kind of permit. So now on to the Water Board's Statewide Restoration General Order, also known as SRGO, because we got to have an acronym for everything. And this covers the 401 water quality certification for federal waters and waste discharge requirements for waters of the state. And the purpose of this order is to provide authorization for eligible projects that don't qualify for the general order for small habitat restoration projects that I talked about earlier. Something a little interesting is that if your project involves state-only jurisdictional waters, so no waters of the US, just waters of the state, you would use the SRGO, this one, instead of the general order for small projects, even if it's a small project, because that one does not cover your project if it just has discharge to state waters. So projects from this are authorized at the regional board level where your project will occur. But if a project crosses jurisdictional boundaries of two regional boards, which has happened already, the request will be submitted to the state water board and reviewed at that level. Requesting a pre-application meeting is part of the process for enrolling under this order. And of course, be sure to read the whole list of steps for enrolling and all the details before you apply. And along with that, a programmatic environmental impact report, or PEIR, was developed. And this is one of the CEQA compliance options if you are using the SRGO. You can use this PEIR for compliance by using the analysis that was done with it as a baseline. You can either do project-specific analysis to verify that the PEIR covers your project, or you can analyze only what hasn't been covered by the PEIR. So this could be done by things like writing a memo to file and findings saying that all the impacts have been analyzed within the scope of the PEIR, or you can do an addendum or a supplemental EIR to look at the additional impacts that weren't covered. So it's depending on what's needed for your project, but it's a huge benefit in terms of time and cost savings. And there's also, we want to make sure people know about the statutory exemption for restoration projects that's administered by CDFW. It's called the SERP for short. So that's another great option. DFW and water board staff have been meeting, usually to help applicants figure out which of these CEQA pathways makes the most sense for their project. So that was a lot of permitting talk. It's a lot to cover. So let's talk about how these tools can be used for an actual restoration project. This is the Butano Creek Backfield Floodplain and Streamflow Enhancement Project. It's a project by San Mateo Resource Conservation District on an actively farmed property owned by the Peninsula Open Space Trust. And in these screenshots from Google Maps, this is where the red marker is. That's where the project is. This project is part of a larger coordinated effort to improve flow, connectivity, and in-stream and floodplain habitat in the Pescadero-Butano watershed. So it's building upon work that's already been done on downstream parcels. And it's 4.2 acres of disconnected floodplain and 1,800 feet of stream channel. So it definitely does not fit into that small project type category because of the stream length. And it's going to provide in-stream flow benefits for more than 4 miles downstream to Pescadero Marsh. And this watershed is a high priority for recovering state and federally listed salmonids. This photo is looking to the northeast with Butano Creek running along the northern and eastern edges of the field. And so for one part of this project, the floodplain part, they're going to reconnect the floodplain by creating 4.2 acres of stage 0 floodplain. We're going to lower the current floodplain surface by as much as several feet, and that'll allow the stream to access that lowered floodplain during base flow conditions. And that will also increase access to some other historic floodplain. It'll get flooded more frequently and provide some low velocity habitat for juvenile coho and steelhead. And it also, that more frequent inundation will also help some adjacent wetlands and enhance those for some other special status species. And in addition to that, they're going to replace some roughness elements, so some log jams, some post-assisted log structures or PALs, some more habitat features, and then also this has a flow aspect to it. So they're going to expand an off-channel pond and have a forbearance agreement. So the farm will get the water it needs to irrigate, but there'll be more dry season flows in Butano Creek. And this is just a drone view of the site from above. And here's the part of Butano Creek where the large wood structures will be installed. And this slide might look a little familiar and a little different. This is showing the suite of permitting pathways that were used for this project. So NIMP Central Coast PBO for those anadromous fish species. And along with that, the CD with the Coastal Commission, since this is in the coastal zone. I think the San Mateo RCD has used that consistency determination, I think, the most of anyone in the state. They're also using the SRGO through the San Francisco Bay Regional Water Quality Control Board, and then that CEQA statutory exemption. And before applying to use the SERP, extensive outreach was conducted to neighboring landowners, resource management agencies, including CDFW and the Association of Ramaytush Ohlone, sharing project designs, and related documents at different stages of development. And that's an important part of that, that SERP process. They use the Restoration Management Permit for Central California Coast Coho and the San Francisco garter snake, which is a fully protected species. So that's why the RMP instead of the CD. And in the RMP, they do reference, the other authorizations like the PBO and the SRGO. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service PBO was used to cover the San Francisco garter snake, as well as the California red-legged frog. And then Army Corps permitting was done using Nationwide 27. So this is just to show how this whole package of things can be used together. And what's amazing is that everything over here didn't exist a couple of years ago. So that was a lot of information, and believe it or not, there's even more that I didn't have time to cover today. So I encourage you to visit our technical resources page on our website, and that has links to all the permit documents. We've got some guidance documents, that HREA video, all sorts of things. You can email us at restoration@suscon.org for free technical assistance. And we'll talk you through your project and what your options are, get you all the information you need. And you can also sign up for our email newsletter, that's the latest from our program. And we also sometimes use that to send out surveys to help inform our work. And stay tuned for a new Accelerating Restoration website that'll have basically everything I talked about today and so much more. This is going to be an important resource hub, I think, for project proponents and agency staff. It's going to have some exciting resources on there. And just to show you one of the things we have on our technical resources page, this is our essential permitting guide. It's a resource we share pretty frequently. We hear some people have it, stuck on their wall. This is a snapshot of the first page, and these things sum up the eligibility requirements for all these different pathways. So it's kind of a good cheat sheet and a good place to start. And it took a lot of different funders to make this effort possible. So I want to recognize our funders now, including the State Coastal Conservancy, and give them a big thank you. And I'll kind of wrap this up by encouraging you to take advantage of these authorizations that really do put restoration on a separate permitting path, and to share them with your grantees if you fund restoration projects. Please don't be shy about asking agency staff about these new pathways. It's going to take some time before they all know about them and are comfortable using them. But our goal is that over time, using these tools will be the standard course of business. And here's my contact information, and I have some thank yous. First of all, I want to thank you for inviting me to give this presentation, and thank you for your time today. I also want to thank all of our agency partners for their work to get these permitting tools in place and for implementing them. And a lot of the information I used today was from a series of presentations that they all gave. I also want to thank all the restoration project proponents, funders, and implementers out there who inform our work and use these permitting tools and share their stories with us, like San Mateo RCD did for this presentation. And with that, we will take questions, and I'll stop screen sharing.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was really great. We really appreciate your efforts to, spread the word about these new permitting tools and all your tips on how to really maximize the benefits they can provide. So I'll just ask folks if you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the Q&A box. As we sort of wait for questions to come in, I have one. So you mentioned at the end something about the Accelerating Restoration website you're developing and protection measures selection tool. So I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that and who the audience for this website is, and really what it's designed to do and what it's designed to help with.
Yeah, so this website is designed for restoration project proponents, people who are going to be using these tools and need all these details. I've also heard it will be helpful for agency staff. And it's going to have all of these options listed by agency, multiple ways to search for them, and example projects for different ones, like the one I talked about, and there'll be others that I'll add over time. And another whole page of resources, guidance documents, acronyms, there's so many of those. And then we're also working on a protection measures selection tool to integrate into that website. And you'll be able to query the measures from all of the NMFS PBOs, the Fish and Wildlife Service PBO, Statewide Restoration General Order, and answer a series of questions about your project, and it'll help filter down that list of protection measures, and then you can export it in Excel to then work with, because some of them do have kind of a long list of measures. So I'm pretty excited to have those for when those tools get to go live, and we will definitely appreciate any feedback people have. And if people have used these tools and want to have their project featured as an example project, either there or on our blog, the Sustainable Conservation blog, or both, definitely reach out.
That's great. Very exciting. Cool. We have a couple questions in the Q&A, so we'll start with one from Jeff Lumens. So we have an active project underway in an estuarine area in the coastal zone. If we have already gone through some of the standard permitting processes with some agencies but have more to go, can we still submit for programmatic permitting for the rest, or does that have to be done from the beginning? Give me answers for that.
I would think that there's still the possibility of, with the rest of the agencies. Yeah, Jeff, definitely reach out, and we can go through what you have so far and what you need, and talk through all of those options for your project.
Great. And one more in the Q&A. Any new pathways related to getting CDP exemptions for small to moderate scale restoration projects from the California Coastal Commission?
That, I don't know. I would have to get back to you on that. I know there's some other things happening, some more related to, fire and that kind of work, vegetation management, but I'm not sure about any other new pathways. Yeah, definitely feel free to follow up by email, and we can set up a call to talk more about that.
Okay, while we wait for any other questions, I do have one more, kind of more of a broad question, but I was just curious, could you talk a little bit more about sort of how the Accelerating Restoration Program got started, and how it's sort of evolved over time?
Yeah, it started actually on the coast in Elkhorn Slough, with there was a big problem with lots of sediment going into there from a lot of soil erosion from certain farming practices, and that's where it began. And with this, what ended up being called the Partners in Restoration Program, working with the resource conservation districts and Natural Resources Conservation Service. So it began there, and then there were some more PIR programs set up around the state, mostly on the coast, and then kind of evaluated that program and realized that it was just too much work to set up each one of these small programs. And that's when we shifted to that regional approach, and then the statewide approach after we did the regional approach. But it definitely took time to get to where we are today.
It's amazing. I mean, it's a great program, and I think we're all lucky to have this resource for permitting. Any other questions? Feel free to put them in the chat. We've got some time left in our hour, so now is the time if you have any questions for Stephanie. I'll just give it a few minutes maybe.
Yeah, and if you have more detailed project questions, yeah, reach out definitely at restoration@susca.org. We're happy to talk through all your details of your project and your options, and help steer you in a good direction.
Yeah, that was
Oh yeah, sorry, I just thought of one more thing.
Oh, go ahead.
if there's other permitting challenges you're having too, or things you think we could work on, some sticking points, other areas that are in kind of the realm of things that we work on fixing, definitely let us know about those too. We like to get that kind of feedback from people out implementing these projects is what guides our work.
Great. I was just going to say that was a very content heavy presentation. There's just so much good information in there. So we will be sharing slides for folks to review after this webinar. So just look out for my follow-up email, and I'll provide a recording link as well as the slides from today and some of those links that I put in the chat to the great resources that Stephanie provided.
Thank you. Yeah, I know it's a lot. It's a lot of content.
It's important though. Good information to have.
And that's why we built a whole website to break all of this down, because it is a lot, and to connect the dots between all of these things. And another thing we'll have on the website is, here's the one thing, here's some other pathways that it works well with, just to help guide people. That's
great. We have one more from Nasa Frechette. Did I pronounce that right, Nasa? Do you have any of these pathways to improve process for 408 permit with ACOE?
These ones are not for the 408 process. That is another one we have been hearing about. So if you have some more thoughts on that and how it could be improved, we are thinking about, other things, now that we've done this, other areas that could be improved. And I think 408 and other federal policies are one of them. So definitely, if you have ideas or particular issues that you are having, let us know.
Great. Any other questions? Okay, well, yeah, like Stephanie said, feel free to follow up with her if you have anything else that you want to talk to sustainable conservation about. Thank you so much for joining today. You look out for an email from me with all the resources we shared today. And again, a huge thank you to our presenters and to Sustainable Conservation for this work. And take care, everybody, and have a great week. Thanks for joining.
Thanks.